Good morning, problem solvers. Velko Chief here, the professional problem solver, coming to you live straight from Velko Academy. And today is episode number 3 from our show, The Problem Solvers. How do you feel this morning? I feel great and I'm ready to get right into it. Today, we're going to talk about negotiations. See, when we think about negotiations, we always uh, probably think about negotiating a big event or like a one-time thing. Maybe when we buy a house or when we buy a car or when we negotiate our salary with our employer or whatever the case might be. Negotiations in the average human's mind is a one-time event and something that you need to prepare for once in a while. But in reality, we negotiate every single day, and negotiation is a skill that every human needs to perfect. Every human needs to master. If you want to do life well and properly, you need to be good at negotiations. So today, I want to share with you some of the negotiation tips that I can share, and some of the negotiation rules that I have, and principles that I always uh, protect and keep and teach. So hopefully you could become a better negotiator after this Thursday morning. Today is August 6th, and it's the only opportunity to live that day. So August 6th, 2020, Thursday morning, you're going to become a master negotiator. So sit down, grab a pen and paper, grab your coffee, and in the next 30 minutes, you're going to learn how to negotiate and what are some of the rules you always must respect in order to become a master negotiator. Are you ready? Who's in here? Please say hello so we can get started. All right, so the first thing we gotta establish is, when do people negotiate? People don't only negotiate on these big events when they're buying big stuff or when they're talking about their salary or um, creating some type of agreement. People negotiate on daily basis, and that's for small things as well. For example, as a parent, I have an 8-year-old daughter. I choose the approach of negotiations. Instead of forcing her to do stuff, I give her alternatives and she chooses one. So that's a form of negotiations. And uh, she had learned now to approach me with negotiation uh, tactic to get things for herself. So I like that approach, and it always works. For example, if I want her to try Brussels sprouts, this is not something that kids look forward to. I would offer her something that she wants anyways, and I was going to give her anyways. And uh, now we have a Brussels sprout problem that we need to overcome. And I offered chocolate or the ice cream that I was going to give her anyways, after we have some Brussels sprouts. So it really helps me out to negotiate with my daughter, and I'm teaching her the most important skill, one of the most important skills in life. There's obviously a few life skills that everyone must know, and negotiations is one of them if you want to win in life. Okay, so we use negotiations with our kids, with our spouses, with our parents, with our friends, with our coworkers. So we negotiate on daily basis. I'm going to start with few negotiation tips, right? So the first thing you got to do, if you're in a business setting and you're negotiating for a specific price for you when you're buying an item, you got to understand that if you are on the side of the salesperson or on the side of the consumer, either way, if you want people to take you seriously and if you want people to take your offer seriously, you need to be sitting down. You need to be sitting down. So negotiating is always done while sitting, proper negotiating. Rule number one for negotiations is, once when you give your offer, if you're the salesperson and you make the offer first, um, once when the offer is presented, whoever speaks first loses the deal. I mean, this is like the oldest rule of negotiations. And you probably heard it if you were in sales, but it's so true. So I've had situations in my career where I've made the offer, and the person right there across the table from me was thinking for about 30 minutes, and I didn't say a word. And after 30 minutes, he said yes. So he knew about that rule that if he opens his mouth first, he's going to lose. And eventually he got worn out and he said yes. So this rule, it might be silly to some, it might feel old school to many, but it works every single time. I don't know how. There's something about the energy, but whoever speaks first after the offer is made will lose. So it's one of the oldest rules. That's why I wanted to start with this one, besides the one that you need to be sitting down. If you're a salesperson and you're negotiating on your feet, it's a shame because only one profession is allowed to negotiate on their feet, and that is the oldest profession known. Mostly for, um, we're not going to get in there, but you know what I'm talking about. So, always negotiate while sitting down. If you're a salesperson, you must demand that. You must make sure that your clients are sitting down when you're making your offering, and whoever speaks first after the offering will lose emotionally and psychologically. So when it comes down to offering, who should give the first offer? It depends. That really depends on who's got more leverage. In negotiations, everything is about leverage. So that leads me to explaining the four different selling styles. There are four different selling styles. And the first, I'm going to start with the most effective one. The first selling style, it's all about leverage. It's called convincing. That's when we leave no margin of doubt. Convincing is done mostly with energy. When we know that the person who is across the table from us needs our product more than we need to sell it, we have more leverage, right? When we know that it's a seller's market and we're the salespeople, and the demand is high and the supply is low, we have more leverage. We have natural confidence. We have um, natural energy that allows us to have the upper hand, if you may. So when we have leverage, we negotiate with confidence. So when the supply is low, we have the supply, and the demand is high, we have natural confidence, natural leverage. And we could create leverage if we're better prepared. If we're experienced salespeople, and if we do investigation on our clients, we could always be in a position of leverage if we know what the need is or what the want is, because we could use that to create emotional attachment to the product, and we could always put ourselves in a position of leverage. And I teach that. If you're interested in how to always put yourself in a position of leverage while you're negotiating, you could definitely reach out to me, and we could have a conversation on how I can protect you and help you, so you could be in that position every time. But in convincing, when you become a master salesperson and a professional salesperson, and when you commit yourself to always, always, always prepare before every presentation you make and before every negotiations you start, um, you will master convincing. And convincing gives you an opportunity to close 100% of your clients if you're really, really good at it, because you proactively create the solution for the problem, you demonstrate the solution of the problem, and people are left speechless and just say yes. So the second selling style is probably the most popular selling style. It's called persuading, and persuading is the typical salesperson that you know. The reason why most people don't want to get into sales is the persuading sales style. So persuading means you are very high energy, and you are never give up type of salesperson, and you're always there to ask for the sale one more time, just like Columbo. And you have this great charisma, and you're just super enthusiastic, and that's what persuading is. This is the typical salesperson who never gives up, the person who smiles obnoxiously loud, and you know what I'm talking about. So persuaders would be successful 75% of the times when they try to close deals, and they will lose 25% of the introverts who don't want to be persuaded, people who are afraid of being closed, and people who don't like that sales process, and just people who don't enjoy being convinced and sold, right? So persuaders are very persistent and they're very good, but they would close 75% of the opportunities they have through persuading. The third selling style is negotiator, and most salespeople are negotiators. I would say that probably 1 to 5% of the salespeople are true professionals, and they have all the leverage, and they convince their clients. About 10% of all salespeople are great persuaders, and they persuade their clients, and they're very persistent, and they're top producers, but they're not as certain as the people who bet on convincing. And you also have about 50% of all salespeople, if not more, maybe 60, 70% of all salespeople are master negotiators. So what that means is they would bring the sale to negotiations as soon as humanly possible. So that's why we're going to talk about negotiations today, because it's very, very, very popular in the world of sales and also in our everyday life. So, um, in negotiations, we lose 50% of our opportunities, and that's also because of the lack of understanding what negotiations mean, and the lack of knowledge, and because people are really afraid of negotiations. So sometimes all we need to do is give them a little bit of a red flag, and they would stop negotiations. In negotiations, there's a lot of uncertainty. A lot of people don't know whether or not they have a good deal or a bad deal. It's a matter of perception when it comes down to negotiations. So there's so much uncertainty. That's why people who master negotiations and choose that selling style are usually successful 50% of their opportunities, and that's the most common closing ratio, half of the people. And finally, the worst selling style out there is debating, and there's so many salespeople that argue with their clients, and I never recommend that. And they will be able to strong arm about 25% of their opportunities into a sale, because they have this strong personality, and they're willing to debate about everything, and they're good at arguing, good at debating, and they think that's what selling is. So those are the four selling styles. I wanted to talk about them really quick so you could understand what negotiations when the negotiation really kicks in sales, and when do we need to be prepared as negotiators. So another tip for negotiations is whoever loses interest in pursuing that deal at the moment will lose the deal. So whoever loses interest first is basically out of negotiations. That means if our client loses interest, then we could create the interest back. We could possibly create um, something that would bring our client back. But if we lose interest in our client, or if we lose interest in negotiations, then negotiations is over. So one guaranteed way to end negotiations is when your one of the parties loses interest in the deal. Number another tip for negotiations is to understand what's your BATNA. And this comes from Harvard University, from the business school. And it means better alternative to a negotiated agreement, BATNA. If you walk into negotiations knowing what your bottom line is, that's what people refer to, knowing what you wouldn't go under or over, It gives you that additional confidence that you need to become a master negotiator. So those are a few tips on negotiating. And one of the main ingredients that people forget about negotiations, and negotiations wouldn't work unless there is natural urgency. And people usually would feel more flexible in negotiations when they have an opportunity to make the same purchase at a different time at the same terms and conditions. So negotiations is powerful when you offer unique terms and conditions at that point. And if you don't make negotiations customized for the person you are negotiating with, it would allow them the opportunity to pull back and take advantage of the same offer on another day. So urgency is um, a must-have ingredient in your negotiations. And I want to use the rest of the time we have to just go over a few rules of negotiations that I've been practicing in my career and I've been teaching all my clients and students. And I want to start with a great quote from one of my favorite people, John F. Kennedy, who said, "Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate." Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. Negotiations are important. So the first rule of negotiations, if you are still watching this and you're writing this down, start with rule number one for negotiation is don't negotiate. That's right. Rule number one is don't negotiate. I know you were probably shocked and you're wondering, what are you talking about? But the best negotiators don't negotiate. They close the deal at the first offer because they're good at convincing. Remember, they have all the leverage. They proactively bring up all the strengths and weaknesses, all the reasons why their clients must go with that option. And eventually they just ask for the sale. So you need to sell the value first, solve the problem first, and ask for all the money first. So if you do a good presentation, if you're proactive on touching all the fears, if you're proactive on touching all the potential objections before they even arrive, and if you have that confidence and that leverage that you can see the same picture that's in front of the person who's negotiating with you, then you will be able to close the deal with no negotiations. And that is the purpose of becoming a great negotiator. It's kind of like if we compare it to sports, many people don't like Floyd Mayweather as a boxer, but because he doesn't get hit very often, right? He doesn't get into those um, brawls, right? And as a boxer is a sport of defense. As a boxer, he is the master because he doesn't get hit. So what's the point of training all those years? Um, how to be a great boxer if you go out there and destroy your uh, face and get all these concussions, right? So he's a smart man who learned the skill how to protect himself in a boxing match, and he's got 50 something wins. He's like the greatest boxer ever lived. And if we compare that approach, that's what the best salespeople do. They learn how to not get hit. They learn how to negotiate without negotiating, if that makes sense. So the next rule for negotiations is don't negotiate with yourself. Rule number two, never negotiate with yourself. This is one of the most common mistakes salespeople do, and people do, period. They negotiate with themselves. So don't offer a discount just because you're assuming your client wouldn't be able to afford your product, or don't lower your initial offer because you're assuming the person in front of you is not going to accept it. That means you're negotiating with yourself in your head, assuming the other person's answer. This is one of the most common mistakes, and almost 99% of everyone who negotiates makes that mistake. So, rule number two is don't negotiate with yourself. Don't underestimate your value just because you assume the person in front of you is not going to pay it. right? Wait until the response instead of assuming the response. Okay. Rule number three for negotiations is never accept the first offer. Never accept the first offer. Um, so what that means is if you accept the first offer, the person across the table from you would assume that um, it happened too easy, and it would create what's called in negotiations cold feet, right? So if I'm offering something, and let's say I have a little bit of room, and I have $200 profit, and my cost is $1,000. So I say, okay, do you want to buy it for 1,200? And the person says yes, and immediately in my mind I would think, okay, I could have probably sold it for 1,400 because that yes came way too fast, right? So never accept the first offer. Make it a little bit more difficult for the person you're negotiating with, and keep in mind that there's always there's always a little bit more, and you can get a little bit more only if you try. So the next rule for negotiations is to never make the first offer after your proposal. If you're the one leading negotiations, it doesn't matter if it's in sales or if it's in personal life. If I'm negotiating with my daughter and I say, okay, you can have ice cream if you go to bed at 9 p.m. And before I hear the answer, if I say, okay, let's do it 10 p.m., that means I just changed the rules and negotiation terms and conditions, and I was the one who made the initial offer. So if you're the one that makes the initial offer, never, ever, ever, ever make your own counter offer. Never, ever make the first uh, offer after your initial proposal. So this is a major mistake, creates uncertainty in the other person's mind, and they pull off and they pull back and they don't want to continue most of the time, or they take advantage of you and they get much greater result than initially would have gotten because you showed weakness in negotiations. So that's why I led these rules with John F. Kennedy, who said never negotiate out of fear, but never fear to negotiate. So never make the first offer after your proposal. That shows weakness and it shows uncertainty. And a lot of times you would either lose the deal or definitely lose a lot of the profit. Okay, so the next rule for negotiations, rule number 5, is listen more and talk less. You know, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. So you got to use it accordingly, and using the ears 80% of the time and using your mouth 20% of the time is probably the best advice I've ever heard in negotiations. The more quiet you keep, the more information you collect, and the more the other person in a moment of emotional uncertainty might share some information that you could use in negotiations in the heated battle. You got to be able to think on your feet when you negotiate. So in order to think on your feet, you got to have more information. In order to collect more information, you got to shut up and listen, because if you keep talking while you're talking, you don't really accept any information. So the person who talks more in negotiations usually loses more money. The person who talks less and listens more usually wins in negotiations. So rule number 5 is listen more and talk less. We're going back to rule number rule number 4 real quick. Never make the first offer after your proposal. And uh, once when you make your proposal, we're going back to the second rule, which is don't negotiate with yourself and don't speak first, right? So rule number 6, never offer free gifts. No such thing as a free gift. It doesn't matter how cheap or insignificant it is. If you're selling furniture or refrigerators, you know, even if you have a free delivery included, if it's not advertised, don't offer it for free. Use it as massive value item, or or uh, make sure that you monetize the value of that offer in front of your clients so they understand that everything costs money. So no free gifts, always get something in return. If you're going to be doing the free delivery, ask them for referrals. If you're going to be doing the free delivery, ask them to pay a little bit more. If you're going to be doing free delivery, ask them to give you a review or testimonial. Ask for something in return, because people feel more comfortable when negotiations are fair, and when they have reciprocity with the person they're doing business with. So info cooperation is included, so never ever ever offer free gifts. Make sure you get something in return if you're going to be sweetening the deal for someone, right? Rule number 7 is don't break down the cost of your products and services. If you can, that just creates more tension. It slows down negotiations. It drags them to rabbit holes when you have to explain each fee. So if you're able to just make it easier for the client, and don't really go over breaking down on the cost of each product and each service, if you can do it this price plus taxes and fees, that is probably the best possible way to negotiate, because then a lot of the clients would assume that the fees and the taxes and all those things are just something that they have to mandatory pay, right? So that's a quick tip. There's a rookie's regret that every person starting to learn about negotiations or starting in sales makes, right? I've made that mistake. Everyone makes that mistake. We call it the rookie's regret. It's when you ask yourself, could I have done a little bit better? And um, this happens when you don't follow those previous 7 rules, right? So if you go too fast, if you don't follow the steps, if you're not calm while you're negotiating, you could potentially make the rookie's mistake. You could ask for too little or for too much. So you need to know what the offer means to the other person, to the person across from you. What you need to estimate is, if you're talking about money, for example, what is $1,000 to the person I'm talking about, based on their income, based on their lifestyle? Do they think that's a lot of money, or do they think that's not a lot of money? So when you make the rookie's mistake, it means you didn't really investigate what the client can afford, and the client's temperature, the client's financial thermostat. And a lot of times you either shorten yourself by asking for too little, or a lot of times you ask for too much and you're just way far away and you scare the client. So that's the rookie's mistake. Could I have done better? Yes, if you have prepared yourself, you probably could have done a little bit better. So rule number 9, and we're almost there, is always avoid the quick deal. This is something that happens with amateur negotiators. A lot of the clients who are committing a fraud, or they're trying to take advantage of you, will try to close the deal as fast as possible. So if they speed up, they saw you've made a mistake. A lot of times we make mistakes when we negotiate. A lot of times we assume something is included. Like, for example, I bought home theater system from Best Buy a year ago or so, or maybe a couple years ago, and I asked the salesperson several times, do wiring come with the home theater system? And I know that the high-end home theater systems don't come with any cables, right? So the salesperson told me twice that they do, and I knew they don't. So I asked maybe 3 or more times clearly, like I tried to help them get out of it. And I asked, are you sure that when I go home I'll be able to plug in that system and actually enjoy a movie with the home theater system? Is everything included in the box? Does it come with all of the cables that are going to connect to the TV? Yes, yes, yes. Are you 100% certain of that? Are you 1 million percent certain? Yes, I'm 10 million percent. All right. And we ended up uh, buying a home theater system, and it came without the cables. So that salesperson definitely made a mistake, and I ended up purchasing the home theater system a little bit faster because I ended up getting the cables for free. So People will take advantage of you if you make a mistake in negotiations, and they would want to close the deal immediately. So if your client is making it way too easy for you, if your client is way too fast, it's way too good to be true, you need to slow down and make sure you haven't made any mistakes and you haven't um, misquoted something. And finally, actually, I'm going to give you 11 rules. 11 rules because 11 is my favorite number. So number 10 is never tell anyone what your bottom line is. This is a mistake that many people make in negotiations. So never tell what your bottom line is. Never share what your bottom line is, because that would eliminate you from the competition. So let's say you've negotiated, you didn't close the deal, and at the end the buyer would ask you, what's your bottom line? Never share that number with you, with the person you're negotiating. So rule number 11, before I let you go, is never take a no from a person who couldn't give you yes. That's my favorite rule. Never take a no from a person who couldn't give you yes. Well, thank you so much for joining me this morning. I know that I promised the show is going to start at 8 a.m., and it's been starting little after 8 for the past 3 days. So right now we're trying to figure out the best time. The more people are involved, the more people are watching, the more I'm going to prioritize this show, and the more I'm going to do it right. So I want to encourage you to invite more people to the group. Show up every morning at 8 a.m. and let's learn from each other. If you want to be involved, I would love to have you uh, host the show or be a guest on the show, and share solutions to problems. This is what this group is all about. So everyone is welcome. You can feel free to invite people from all walks of life, and everyone has something they could share with members of the group so they could learn and implement in their own life. And let's just do life together. It was a pleasure sharing my negotiation rules with you and some tips on negotiations, and hopefully you can use those tips and implement them and become the best version of you. Make it a great day.